You can watch the rest of the conversation online at cspan.org. Live to Capitol Hill now for a Senate Homeland Security Committee meeting on digital currencies that allow people to exchange goods and services online without using real money. The chair, Democrat from Delaware, Tom Carper.
Senator Bill Roth, whom I succeeded here in the United States Senate, used to say, many years ago, he would say, his advice was, wear a big button when you're campaigning so that you'll remember your name and so will other people too. So we want to make sure people remember your name. Over the past several months, this committee has engaged in an investigation into the potential implications of virtual currencies. During the course of this inquiry, we've examined the issues and potential risks and threats that virtual currencies pose, as well as some of the potential promise that some believe they can bring. In addition, we have explored with several departments and agencies throughout our federal government how they are approaching virtual currencies as an emerging technology. This has included looking at how they are coordinating together to develop a whole-of-government approach that is consistent and informed. Virtual currencies, perhaps most notably Bitcoin, have captured the imagination of some, struck fear among others, and confused the heck out of the rest of us, including me. Indeed, based on conversations that my staff and I have had with dozens, maybe more, dozens of individuals, both inside and outside of government, it is clear that the knowledge and expectation gaps are wide. Fundamental questions remain about what a virtual currency actually is, how it should be treated, and what the future holds. Virtual currency can best be described as digital cash. It is generated by computers, lives on the internet, and can be used to purchase real and digital goods across the world. Some proponents believe that digital currencies can prove valuable to those in developing countries without access to stable financial systems. Others believe it could prove to be the next generation payment system for retailers, both online and in the real world. At the same time, however, virtual currencies can be an effective tool for those looking to launder money, for those looking to traffic illegal drugs, for those looking to exploit children around the world, and the list goes on. While virtual currencies have seen increased attention from regulators, from law enforcement, from investors and entrepreneurs in recent months, there are still many unanswered questions and unresolved issues. This isn't the first time that advances in technology have posed challenging questions, challenging issues for policymakers and for society as a whole. As we know, technology is dynamic and changes quickly. Concepts like email and even the Internet itself were once alien and difficult to understand and navigate. Now most of us can read and respond to email on a device we keep in a purse or coat pocket and search the web on multiple platforms. I like to use the example, when I first showed up for duty here in the U.S. Senate in 2001, we received for every email that came in to us from constituents in Delaware and across the country, for every email we received probably 10 to 15 letters. I asked my staff a couple of months ago to tell me if that ratio had changed. And now for every 12 or 13 emails we get one letter. And that's probably a pretty good metaphor for the situation. I'll be the first to admit that, like most Americans, I am no technical expert in virtual currencies. I think all of you are gathered in this room who are, and we'll see. But hopefully some of our panelists are those experts, and we'll learn a lot from you today. What I do know is that a number of smart people, both inside and outside of government, view this as a major emerging issue that is deserving of our attention, and that includes this committee's attention. The ability to send and receive money over the Internet, nearly anonymously, without a third party, has a lot of wide-ranging implications. Our government needs to pay attention to this technology and to understand and, where appropriate, address these implications. This was made all the more clear last month when federal law enforcement took down and seized an online marketplace called the Silk Road, on which many illegal products and services were bought and sold via Bitcoin. The most popular products for sale were illegal drugs, foreign documents such as IDs and passports. Other services were also for sale, including hacking services. We're told that approximately $1.2 billion in transactions were made through the Silk Road. The site lived on what is often called the dark web, also known as the deep web. The dark web consists of web pages and data that are only available via special software that keeps users anonymous. Many sites and data on the dark web have been deliberately built to be untraceable in order to protect the anonymity of the user. And Silk Road was one of those sites. My understanding is that individuals could navigate to Silk Road anonymously and use Bitcoin, which can be sent to someone nearly anonymously to make purchases. The anonymity of the marketplace and near anonymity of the currency made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track, and therefore made it an attractive place for criminal activity. In fact, in the course of our investigation, the Department of Homeland Security informed us that the suspects who allegedly sent ricin to President Obama in April of this year was a vendor on Silk Road. Law enforcement, including the FBI, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Secret Service, should be applauded for their work in taking down a major international criminal enterprise. But while Silk Road was perhaps the most well-known, if not the only marketplace where illicit goods are bought and sold through Bitcoin transactions, today a number of similar enterprises that accept Bitcoins are still in business, selling weapons, child pornography, and even murder for hire services. While today I suspect we'll talk a lot about the well-known virtual currency Bitcoin, there are numerous other virtual currencies operating on the Internet today, each with its own set of specific features. That said, whether it's Bitcoin or any of the other virtual currencies, the federal government and society as a whole need to come together to figure out how to effectively deal with it. Whether or not digital currencies prove to be a boom or a bust, I think it's clear that some folks just want a chance to try and play by the rules. And that's difficult to do if the rules or proper authorities aren't clear or if the future is uncertain. It's also difficult if a large number of bad apples are allowed to spoil the bunch. With that, normally I would turn to my right and I would say, Dr. Coburn, you're recognized for whatever comments you would like to offer. I believe he's traveling back from Oklahoma. I hope he'll be able to join us at some point during this hearing. Others of our colleagues will too. We start voting at 5:30. And what usually happens on Monday afternoons is people are coming in, senators are coming in from all over the country, and they will drift in and out of hearings like this one. And my hope is that before we're done, a number of them will be able to join us. I want to take now just a moment, if I can, to welcome and introduce, just very briefly, our first panel of distinguished witnesses. Our first panel is Jennifer, on our first panel, our first witness, in fact, the leadoff hitter, is Jennifer Shasky-Calvary, Director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, known as FinCEN, a bureau of the Treasury Department. As Director of FinCEN, Ms. Shasky-Calvary, do you go by both names? Is it?
Typically just Shasky.
Okay. All right. As Director of FinCEN, Ms. Shasky oversees the protection of U.S. financial systems from money laundering and other forms of illicit financial activity. Prior to joining Treasury, Director Shasky-Calvary, also known as Director Shasky, serves as the Chief of Asset Forfeiture and Money Laundering Section at the Department of Justice. Our second witness has a name I've never heard before, and her first name is Mythili, right? Mythili? It sort of rhymes with mightily, right? Mythili Raman. I have that right? Good. Has your name ever been mispronounced?
Many times.
Today? Today?
Not today.
Oh, good. We'll try to keep it that way. Ms. Raman is Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice Criminal Division. As head of the Criminal Division, Ms. Raman oversees nearly 600 attorneys who prosecute federal crime cases across our country. Prior to joining the Criminal Division, Ms. Raman served for nearly a decade as an Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, our neighbor. Our final witness on this panel is Edward Lowry. Mr. Lowry is a special agent in charge of the Criminal Investigation Division at the Secret Service. Mr. Lowry began his career with the Secret Service in 1992 and has been in his current position since February of 2012. In this position, Mr. Lowry directs and coordinates all investigative activities of the agency and the daily operation of the Secret Service investigative offices located throughout the world. Previously, Mr. Lowry established and ran the Secret Service's Cyber Protective Initiative and coordinated operations of the Cyber Investigations Branch and the Cyber Intelligence Section. Again, we want to thank all of you for your service. We thank you for your preparation for today, for your testimony, and for your willingness to respond to the questions that will be asked to you here, and some that will be asked in writing subsequent to this hearing. With that, Ms. Shasky, Director Shasky, you are recognized. And I don't know how long they told you had to give your testimony. What do we say? Pardon? All right, 7 minutes, but you can go a little longer than that. If you go way beyond that, we'll have to draw it to a close. But you're recognized. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman.
Just know that for you and the other witnesses, your entire statement will be made a part of the record. Please proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Carver.
Good afternoon.
As you mentioned, I am Jennifer Shasky Calvary, the Director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the important regulatory, enforcement, and analytical work we are doing at FinCEN to prevent illicit actors from exploiting the U.S. financial system as technological advances such as virtual currency create new ways to move money. FinCEN's mission is to safeguard the financial system from illicit use, combat money laundering, and promote national security through the collection, analysis, and dissemination of financial intelligence and the strategic use of our financial authorities. We work to achieve this mission by administering the Bank Secrecy Act, this country's primary anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing regulatory regime. By sharing the financial intelligence we collect, as well as our analysis and expertise with law enforcement and regulatory partners, and by building global cooperation amongst financial intelligence units throughout the world. Recognizing the emergence of new payment methods, the potential for abuse by illicit actors, and understanding that AML protections must keep pace with these advancements in technology, FinCEN began working with our partners several years ago to study this issue. Here's what we learned. Illicit actors might decide to use a virtual currency to store and transfer value for many of the same reasons as legitimate users, but also for some more nefarious ones. Specifically, an illicit actor may choose to use virtual currency because it enables the user to remain relatively anonymous, is easy to navigate, may have low fees, is accessible across the globe with a simple internet connection, can be used to both store and make international transfers of value, does not typically have transaction limits, is generally secure, features irrevocable transactions, and depending on the system, may have been created with the intent to facilitate money laundering. And finally, provides a loophole from AML, CFT regulatory safeguards in most countries around the world. Indeed, the idea that illicit actors might exploit the vulnerabilities of virtual currency to launder money is not merely theoretical. Liberty Reserve, a virtual currency administrator, engaged in a $6 billion money laundering operation, facilitating credit card fraud, identity theft, investment fraud, computer hacking, narcotics trafficking, and child pornography. And just recently, the Department of Justice alleged that customers of Silk Road, the largest illegal drug and contraband marketplace on the Internet, were required to pay in bitcoins to enable both the operator of Silk Road and its sellers to evade detection and launder hundreds of millions of dollars. That being said, it is also important to put virtual currency in perspective. It has been publicly reported that Bitcoin processed transactions worth approximately $8 billion over the last year, whereas the best estimate for the amount of criminal proceeds available for laundering throughout the financial system, at least in 2009, was $1.6 trillion. By way of comparison, in 2012, PayPal processed $145 billion in online payments. Western Union made remittances totaling $81 billion, and Bank of America made $245 trillion in wire transfers. Thus, while of growing concern, to date, virtual currencies have yet to overtake more traditional methods to move funds, whether for legitimate or criminal purposes. Nonetheless, to address growing concerns, in July 2011, after a public comment period designed to receive feedback from industry, FinCEN released 2 regulations which update several definitions and provide the needed flexibility to accommodate innovation in the payment system space, including virtual currencies, under our pre-existing regulatory framework. Then, this last March, as a follow-up to the regulations, FinCEN issued additional guidance to further clarify the compliance obligations for those virtual currency actors covered by our regulations. In short, they are required to register with FinCEN, put AML controls in place to harden themselves as targets, and provide certain reports to FinCEN on suspicious and other activity. It is in the best interest of virtual currency providers to comply with these regulations for a number of reasons. First is the idea of corporate responsibility. Legitimate financial institutions do not go into business with the aim of laundering money on behalf of criminals. Any financial institution could be exploited for money laundering purposes, though. What is important is for institutions to put controls in place to deal with those money laundering threats and to meet their AML reporting obligations. At the same time, being a good corporate citizen and complying with regulatory responsibilities is good for a company's bottom line. Every financial institution needs to be concerned about its reputation and show that it is operating with transparency and integrity within the bounds of the law. Legitimate customers will be drawn to a virtual currency or administrator or exchanger where they know their money is safe and where they know the company has a reputation for integrity. And banks will want to provide services to administrators or exchangers that show not only great innovation, but also great integrity and transparency. The decision to bring virtual currency within the scope of our regulatory framework should be viewed as a positive development for this sector. It recognizes the innovation virtual currencies provide and the benefits they might offer society. Several new payment methods in the financial sector have proven their capacity to empower customers and expand access to financial services. We want such advances to continue. However, those institutions that choose to act outside of the law will be held accountable. FinCEN will do everything in its regulatory power to stop abuses of the U.S. financial system. We have proven our willingness to do just that by using our targeted financial measures under Section 311 of the Patriot Act to name Liberty Reserve as a primary money laundering concern and entering into rulemaking to terminate its access to the U.S. financial system. We stand ready to take additional regulatory actions as necessary to stop other abuses. As the financial intelligence unit for the United States, FinCEN must stay current on how money is being laundered in the United States so that we can share this expertise with our many law enforcement, regulatory, industry, and foreign partners, and effectively serve as the cornerstone of this country's AML-CFT regime. We are meeting this obligation in the virtual currency space as we continue to deliver cutting-edge analytical products to inform the actions of our many partners. We are committed to remaining at the forefront of developments in the days and years to come. The administration has made appropriate oversight of the virtual currency industry a priority, and FinCEN is very encouraged by the progress we have made thus far. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for being here, for the meeting you had with our staff and me last week, and for your testimony. Thank you. Ms. Rahman, please proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman Carper, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today to discuss the Department of Justice's work regarding virtual currencies. At the Justice Department, we look at virtual currencies through the lens of criminal law enforcement. We recognize that virtual currency systems can be a legal means of exchange, but we also recognize that criminals will always seek to take advantage of new technologies to commit, further, or hide their crimes. Our responsibility as prosecutors is to ensure that we continue to enforce the law, even in new technological settings, and to prevent criminals from using those technologies to create zones of impunity. As I will describe in my testimony today, the Department of Justice has been aware of the threat posed by the criminal use of virtual currencies for several years. We have already brought several important prosecutions involving virtual currencies, and we intend to remain vigilant in ensuring that any criminal use of virtual currency systems is aggressively investigated and prosecuted. As an initial matter, I should note that virtual currency systems, so long as they comply with applicable anti-money laundering and money transmission laws and regulations, are not inherently illegal. and they can be appealing to consumers because they can provide cheap, efficient, and convenient means to transfer currency. Many of those same features, however, also make virtual currencies appealing to criminals. We have seen increasing use of such currencies by drug dealers, traffickers of child pornography, and perpetrators of large-scale fraud schemes. Most significantly, we have seen evidence that criminals are drawn to virtual currencies for two main reasons. First, their perception that virtual currencies offer greater anonymity than traditional financial services, and second, the irreversibility of many virtual currency transactions. These features can significantly complicate our ability to utilize one of the most basic techniques we use in criminal investigations, following the money. The Justice Department has long recognized the potential for the criminal misuse of virtual currency and launched our first major prosecution of an illicit virtual currency service in 2007, when we indicted eGold and its three principal owners on charges relating to money laundering and operating an unlicensed money transmitting business. As that indictment alleged, the only information a customer had to provide to set up an eGold account was a working email address. As a result, eGold became a popular payment method for sellers of child pornography, operators of investment scams, and perpetrators of credit card and identity fraud. At its peak, eGold reportedly moved over $6 million a day. eGold and its owners were convicted in 2008. Since that time, we have continued to ensure that we aggressively address any criminal misuse of virtual currency systems, especially as those systems evolve and develop. When virtual currency systems fail to live up to their obligations under existing law, we take action. Earlier this year, for example, we unsealed charges against Liberty Reserve, an offshore virtual currency business, for allegedly running a $6 billion money laundering operation, the Justice Department's largest ever money laundering prosecution. As alleged in the department's filings, Liberty Reserve became a system of choice for cybercriminals and was used in a wide array of illegal activity, including credit card fraud, identity theft, investment fraud, computer hacking, and the trade of child pornography. As a result of the department's actions and the coordinated actions taken by law enforcement agencies in 17 countries around the world, Liberty Reserve was effectively put out of business. 7 defendants were charged, and numerous assets were seized. One of the defendants pleaded guilty just 2 weeks ago. More recently, the department announced significant steps in its investigation of Silk Road, alleged to be one of the largest online marketplaces for illegal goods and services, including large quantities of illicit drugs. Allegedly operated by a U.S. citizen living in California at the time of his arrest, Silk Road accepted bitcoins exclusively as a payment mechanism on its site. Charges against Silk Road and its administrator were unsealed just last month in 2 different districts. The charges against Silk Road's operator included drug distribution, attempted witness murder, and attempted murder for hire. As part of that takedown of Silk Road, the department seized over 170,000 bitcoins, valued as of this past Friday at over $70 million. The department recognizes that in order to stay abreast of rapidly changing technological environment, we must coordinate our enforcement strategy across the federal government. For that reason, we are working closely with the Virtual Currency Emerging Threats Working Group, a variety of law enforcement agencies both here and abroad, and of course FinCEN. From the view of law enforcement, FinCEN's recent guidance applying anti-money laundering and know your customer requirements to virtual currency exchanges was an important step in safeguarding our collective ability both to deter criminal activity and to investigate it successfully when it occurs. While there is much more to do, the department is encouraged by virtual currency services that are attempting to comply with U.S. law. We will continue to reach out to those services and provide them with training and other opportunities for real discussion about emerging threats, as we have long done with other financial services industry participants. As the virtual currency industry grows, we will continue to explore how new strategies or legislation can play a role in ensuring that virtual currency systems do not become a haven for criminal activity. We look forward to working with Congress to ensure that law enforcement continues to have the tools necessary to enforce the law and protect the public. In the meantime, we will continue to aggressively use our existing authorities to deal with those virtual currency systems that do not comply with the law and to aggressively prosecute criminals who use those systems as part of their criminal schemes. And of course, we will continue to innovate in how we investigate crime to deal with whatever changes may come. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the department's work in this area, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Good. Well, we look forward to asking some questions. We very much appreciate your testimony and for joining us today. Mr. Lara, you're recognized. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman Carper. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security regarding the risks and challenges posed by digital currencies and the role of the United States Secret Service in investigating crimes associated with online payment systems. Digital currencies have developed and grown over the last 17 years as part of the continuing integration of information technology into the financial system. As the original guardians of the nation's financial payment systems, since 1865, the Secret Service has continually adapted its investigative methods to keep pace with the evolving use of information technology within the financial system. Since the founding of eGold in 1996, both digital currencies and various internet-based payment processors and exchangers have grown to be a significant participant in the global financial system, processing tens to hundreds of billions of dollars annually in total transaction volume. Criminals and other illicit organizations use digital currency. These groups seek out those digital currency exchangers and providers that best enable them to conceal their illicit activities. For example, Liberty Reserve is alleged to have laundered more than $6 billion during its operation before the Secret Service joint investigation with ICE and IRS criminal investigations dismantled it. The growth of digital currencies and internet-based payment systems is expected to continue for the foreseeable future, along with the use of these systems in the conduct of criminal activity. DHS law enforcement approaches digital currencies within the context of its authorities to investigate criminal activity. As a result of Secret Service and ICE investigations, exchangers of digital currency have been charged and convicted with operating unlimited, unlicensed money transmitting businesses in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1960 and various state laws. Additionally, as a result of our investigations, digital currency providers have been charged and convicted for money laundering in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1956 and 1957. As FinCEN emphasized in March of this year, digital currency administrators and exchangers have legal responsibilities under various anti-money laundering laws, Title III of the Patriot Act, the Bank Secrecy Act, and FinCEN regulations. DHS law enforcement works closely with interagency, state, local, and international partners in conducting criminal investigations in their respective jurisdictions that may involve the use of digital currencies, including their use for money laundering purposes. In particular, as one of the two federal law enforcement agencies with authority to investigate computer intrusions in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1030, one of the Secret Service's strategic priorities is proactively investigating transnational organized cybercrime and defeating these illicit organizations by arresting their members and seizing and dismantling their criminal infrastructure. The Secret Service has successfully investigated and arrested numerous leaders of major cybercrime operations. For example, the Secret Service arrested Vladislav Horahorn, also known as Bad B, in 2010, and earlier this year apprehended 5 individuals allegedly responsible for the largest data breach ever prosecuted in U.S. history. Over the past 4 years, the Secret Service has arrested more than 4,500 cybercriminals, preventing over $13 billion in losses based on the financial information recovered from those criminals. Importantly, many of these cybercriminals made extensive use of digital currencies as part of their illicit activities. As part of its efforts to disrupt and defeat organized cybercrime, the Secret Service strategically prioritizes investigations of exchangers and administrators of digital currency that perform a substantial criminal role in facilitating widespread illicit activity. As part of these efforts, the Secret Service, in cooperation with other law enforcement agencies and interagency partners, has apprehended the providers of both eGold and Liberty Reserve, ending their operations. The Secret Service has also arrested various illicit exchangers of digital currency that facilitated criminal activity, such as Western Express Incorporated, which was prosecuted by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, resulting in 16 individuals pleading guilty or being convicted. These cases are discussed more fully in my written testimony, and I welcome future opportunities to further discuss our investigative work with you and your staff. Our digital currencies are a tool used by a wide variety of criminals. Accordingly, numerous law enforcement agencies investigate illicit activity that involves the use of digital currencies. Through the Secret Service's nationwide network of electronic crime task forces, federal, state, and local law enforcement collaborate with the private sector and academia to effectively address the challenges that criminals' use of information technology, including digital currency, pose to law enforcement at all levels of government. Additionally, the Secret Service and ICE are participating agencies in FinCEN and work closely with them to ensure regulatory and enforcement activities are coordinated. And, like all federal law enforcement, the success of Secret Service investigations requires partnering with the U.S. attorneys throughout the country. In addition to the asset forfeiture and money laundering and computer crimes and intellectual property sections of the Department of Justice's Criminal Division. The Secret Service and ICE also partner with other federal law enforcement for joint investigations and participate in the Virtual Currency Emerging Threats Working Group. While digital currencies may provide potential benefits, they present real risks through their use by the criminal and terrorist organizations trying to conceal their illicit activity. As such, digital currencies challenge law enforcement's ability to carry out our responsibilities to enforce the law and suppress criminal activity. The Secret Service has a long history of adapting its investigative methods to maintain the integrity of the nation's financial infrastructure. As a DHS law enforcement agency, we are committed to partnering with law enforcement at all levels of government to increase the security of the nation while addressing the challenges posed by digital currencies. The Secret Service will continue to conduct effective criminal investigations to keep America safe and prosperous. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Lowry, thank you so much. And again, our thanks to each of you for your testimonies and your preparation today. And in anticipation of this hearing a week or two ago, I was trying to get my head around this subject, and I asked my staff to talk to me about the early days of the Internet, and there were a number of concerns raised about how it might foster or facilitate illegal activities, and but there are some who said there could be a lot of benefit here as well, and I asked them if that was maybe an analogy that was applicable here for virtual currencies. Just walk us back in time, if you will, the early days of the Internet when you guys were in middle school or before that, and talk to us about some of the early concerns that we had with the bad that made the criminal activity that could flow through the Internet, and at a time when we never imagined we would have the kind of commercial activity that we're going to see in the coming month as people celebrate the holiday season, and by a lot of commerce that takes place over the Internet. A lot of presents are going to be sent over using the Internet. We never imagined anything like YouTube, Wikipedia, Google searches. It's pretty amazing what it's become. The ability to download music, video. Although in the early days, I recall hearing a number of concerns about the bad that could flow from the Internet. Is this a good corollary or not? And if so, how? And if not, why not? And we'll just start with you, Ms. Shasky, please.
Senator, I believe your analogy is an apt one. So often when there's a new type of financial service or a new player in the financial industry, the first reaction by those of us who are concerned about money laundering or terrorist finance is to think about the gaps and the vulnerabilities that it creates in the financial system and how illicit actors will take advantage of those vulnerabilities or gaps. But it's also important that we step back and recognize that innovation is a very important part of our economy. It's very important in this country. It's something that we're known for and proud of and want to continue. So I think the challenge, at least at FinCEN, is for us to balance and have smart regulation that both mitigates the concerns of illicit actors operating in our financial system while at the same time minimizing the burden as much as we can. We believe that we've done just that with this rule by clarifying that virtual currency exchangers and administrators fit within our pre-existing regulatory regime.
All right, thank you. Ms. Rahman, same question. Walk us back in time. Early concerns, those that were realized, and then some of the potential that may have come along through the Internet that perhaps we never envisioned. And does that apply here, that example? Is it appropriate here?
I think, as I alluded to in my written testimony, as emerging technologies develop and change, as law enforcement, we remain attuned to the criminal misuse of those technologies. But of course, as you describe it, there are many legitimate uses. And as I hope I have always also made clear in my testimony, these virtual currency services are not in and of themselves illegal, so long as they comply with our applicable money laundering laws and our money transmission laws and regulations. And so I think it is our duty as law enforcement to stay vigilant about the criminal misuse of those virtual currency systems, while recognizing that, of course, there are many legitimate users of those services. Our experience over the last several years has showed us that there is reason for our vigilance, and there is good reason for us to remain vigilant. Liberty Reserve was the largest money laundering case ever brought by the Department of Justice, and that is an important fact. And it reminds us that there is good reason for us to remain watchful, and we intend to do that. But we also intend to balance that against the need for legitimate users to use those virtual currency systems as it was intended to.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Mr. Lowry, same question, please.
Within the confines of the Secret Service investigations, the Secret Service was enacted to fight counterfeiting at the time in 1865. In the Secret Service, the hallmark of our investigations have always been adapting to a changing threat. As I've said, we started with counterfeit, we've moved into fraud, always defending the nation's financial infrastructure. In the 80s, it was access device fraud when credit cards were starting to become a major issue, a major impact on the financial system, and it naturally segued directly into computer crimes. In recognition of that fact, as I mentioned in my testimony, the Electronic Crimes Task Force model is widely respected throughout the country, and it is the way that the service stays in tune with the changing technology and the threats that can come from the Internet.
All right. A couple of years ago, there's a film out called Dillinger, and my wife, who's usually not a big fan of gangster movies, said when I went to a local theater complex in Delaware, and one of the films showing was Dillinger. She said, "Let's go see that." I said, "Okay." And I'll never forget one of the scenes in the film. Dillinger and his gang, they made their living robbing banks, as you know, shooting people up and getting away with it. And near the latter part of the film, they were on the run, and Dillinger looked up one of his old compadres in the bank robbing business to see if he couldn't give him a hand. And I remember they met, and it looked like the top floor of a big old warehouse had been retrofitted. And you walked in, and there's all these guys, a lot of them wearing like shirts and ties, on old phones, making phone calls. And the Dillinger said, what's going on here? And apparently there were booking operations, numbers operations, and so forth. And the fellow who's running the operation said, "We don't rob banks anymore." And he said, "You're stupid to do that." He said, "This is the future." He said, "This is the future for criminal activity, the way to make money." And I suspect for some people, they see this is a future for them to make money through criminal activity, whether it's in pornography, child pornography, where it's in money laundering, human trafficking, any number of activities. But we figured out how to deal with those guys in that film, wearing their shirts and ties and doing illegal activities, not robbing banks anymore, not shooting people anymore. We figured out how to deal with that. How confident you are that we're going to be able to deal with the potential criminal misbehavior with this new technology that's before us? Mr. Lowry. And the second part, I said, what role does the legislative body, three branches of government, but what role does the legislative body, those of us who privilege to sit in these seats, what role do we have to play to make sure you have the resources you need to meet the dark side of this technology?
Well, again, going back to my testimony, the Secret Service has investigated many first-of-their-kind investigations. We specialize currently in the transnational cyber criminal, the professional criminal that is targeting our financial infrastructure. We operate within the confines of the laws that we are entrusted to enforce. Predominantly 1028, 1029, 1030. which would be access device fraud, identity theft, and computer hacking. You spoke earlier about the change and how the crimes have changed. I believe that one of the largest changes is the reach of the criminal. It used to be that we had to worry about, back in the days of early access device fraud, we had to worry about someone dumpster diving or trying to get an actual, image of your credit card. Today, anyone in the world can reach anyone else in the world, and that's changed how we have to enforce our laws. Again, we are consistently, aggressively, and strategically investigating, trying to direct our investigations to the highest impact within the confines of the existing laws, which I believe there are plenty of cyber criminals in prison right now that would agree were pretty effective.
The second half of my question, and I'd ask you to respond to it, and then we'll turn to Ms. Rahman. But three branches of government: judicial, executive, legislative. The role that we're attempting to play today on this committee is not just an oversight role, although this is a Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. We historically do oversight and have for many, many decades. Homeland Security piece of this committee is actually newer. It's only about 10 years old. But we have a role for oversight. We also have, I think, an obligation or an opportunity here to try to make sure that the administration is working maybe with other law enforcement agencies across the country, but they're working in a cohesive, collaborative manner. And I'm encouraged to see that that might be the case. But what advice would you have for us on the legislative side? Well, how can we be supportive and better enable you to do your very difficult work as this new technology appears before us?
Well, I believe it goes back to the most important part of being able to do this job is the hiring, developing, and retaining of a highly qualified workforce. Obviously, you need a technically gifted investigator to follow the trail and to run these international criminals down. So that is always a challenge, especially in the current fiscal environment. But any support in that realm is definitely appreciated.
All right, thank you. Ms. Rahman?
Your first question was whether we can keep up with the changing technology, and I do think that law enforcement has proven itself to be nimble and aggressive and willing to work together, not only with agencies here in the United States but abroad, in order to effectively combat the threat. I've mentioned Liberty Reserve before, but it's an excellent example of how our agencies have worked together to take down an enormous money laundering operation. We worked together with FinCEN and Treasury. They took coordinated action at the same time that law enforcement made arrests here and abroad. We had 17 other countries working with us for coordinated arrests and takedowns. We seized assets on the same day that arrests were made, and we took down domain names on the same day that arrests were made. So I do think we're nimble enough and creative enough and aggressive enough to be able to combat the threat. And that doesn't mean that we're not unaware of the challenges that are posed by virtual currency. And there are specific challenges that are inherent to virtual currencies that we are remaining attuned to. The anonymity is certainly one that we are paying attention to. The fact that some virtual currency services may be based in countries that have laxer regulatory oversight is of concern to us. There are issues with difficulty in obtaining customer records and a host of other difficulties and challenges that go along with investigating global organizations. But I think, as our track record shows, we're up to the challenge, and we're continuing to work together to ensure that we are innovating as criminals are innovating, and that we stay one step ahead of them. As for what the legislative branch can do, I think as for our criminal statutes, we feel confident that the statutes that we have available to us, our money laundering statutes, our money transmitter statutes, are broad enough to encompass the activity that we've been talking about this afternoon. And in fact, those statutes are the ones that we used in eGold and Liberty Reserve, for example. And of course, to the extent that criminals are using virtual currencies as part of their criminal enterprises, the actual substantive criminal statutes are also applicable. For example, if a child exploitation enterprise is trading child pornographic images in virtual currency, we should be able to charge that under traditional child exploitation statutes. And so we feel confident that the statutes that we have on the books are are flexible enough to meet our needs. That having been said, we're always looking for ways to close any gaps that might arise, or to close any gaps that we might see that we aren't seeing right now. And we'd be happy to continue to work with you and your staff to ensure that we let you know whenever we need those legislative tools.
All right, thank you. Ms. Shasky, would you respond to that question as well, please?
Sure.
Actually, the two questions.
Thankfully, Congress's actions in passing the Bank Secrecy Act and the USA Patriot Act have already given us a strong platform to meet the challenge. So we're confident that we can meet this challenge, at least in the first instance, using that platform. So the Bank Secrecy Act, of course, is this country's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing backbone, which we administer at FinCEN. We issue the regulations under that. In 2011, when we expanded some of our definitions to enable us to have flexibility in going after new payment systems, our hope was that these regulations would live with changes in the market. What we found is that it's done just that. So as virtual currency has come more strongly to the forefront over the last year or 2 years, that definition has been broad enough for us to encompass virtual currency administrators and exchangers in our pre-existing regulations under the Bank Secrecy Act. And then with the USA Patriot Act, Section 311 of that's the section that gives us the authority at FinCEN to name a foreign financial institution as being of primary money laundering concern and to cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And that's exactly the provision we use to confront Liberty Exchange, that targeted financial authority provided to us by Congress. So we feel like we have a pretty good basis on which to act already, but it's hard to predict where the financial system's going to go and what tools we might need next. And we would be very thankful to continue that conversation with Congress to see if any additional tools might be better.
Okay, thank you. And in your testimony, Ms. Shasky, you said on page 11, I think, of your original testimony, I'll just read a couple of sentences from it if I could. You said, several new payment methods in the financial sector have proven their capacity to empower customers, encourage the development of innovative financial products, and expand access to financial services. And you went on to say, we want these advances to continue. And then you said, however, those institutions that choose to act outside of their AML obligations and outside of the law have and will continue to be held accountable. FinCEN will do everything in its regulatory power to stop such abuses of the U.S. financial system. Now, when you talked about several new payment methods in the financial sector that have proven their capacity to empower customers and encourage the development of innovative financial products, maybe expand access to financial services, this is the bright lining in this technology of virtual currencies. Just maybe give us some examples, some concrete examples, if you will, how those have worked out for the good.
Sure. I think the one that comes first to mind is the stored value cards, another area where we've thought not only about the risks from illicit actors, but also the benefits that it can offer to consumers. And we've seen many of the unbanked use prepaid cards to gain their initial access to the U.S. financial system, and many might argue that that's been a positive for society. In my own personal experience, I think of online banking and the changes that's made for me as a consumer, and the idea of ACH, where I can now take a picture of a check and deposit it into my account. Some of these technological advances make things easier for the consumer. And so those would be examples that come to mind. But with each of these, we needed to think in the early days as they came to market, how might criminals use these systems? How might they exploit systems? Because the fact is, any financial service, any type of financial institution can be exploited. Cash is probably still the best medium for laundering money. But we need to, the important thing is to put measures in place that mitigate that risk.
All right. I'm going to ask each of you to take a shot at this question. We've already addressed it to some extent, but I want to come back and do a little deeper dive if we could. The question I want to get to and I want to come back to is whether or not you think that virtual currencies, that would include Bitcoin, fit into our current legal and regulatory framework. And we talked a little bit about this and I explored in the last question, but come back to me, if you will, with some further thoughts on whether you see any gaps in our statutes, any gaps in our regulations regarding virtual currencies. So that's part of the question. The second half of the question, which agencies do you believe need to be at the forefront of the federal government's work on virtual currencies? Two questions. And Mr. Lowry, if you feel up to taking this one first, that would be fine.
Thank you. So is virtual currency within the legal existing laws? I can speak, and I know obviously Bitcoin is the currency that is part of this discussion today. I can speak within the framework of the Secret Service investigations and what we see out there, and I think it's important to recognize that within what we see in our investigations, that the online cyber criminals, the high-level international cyber criminals that we're talking about, have not, by and large, gravitated towards the peer-to-peer cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin. Again, this is within the confines of what we've dealt with. The Eastern European cyber criminals that we have developed a specialty in have, by and large, gravitated towards a centralized digital currency that is, as my colleague discussed earlier, that is based in a locale that may have less regulatory guidelines, may have less aggressive law enforcement. So that is a distinction I think needs made. Is the virtual currency within the existing laws? I believe there are plenty of opportunities for digital currencies to operate within the existing laws and regulations. And as far as the Secret Service investigations are concerned, as long as they fit within the laws and they comply with existing FinCEN guidance, then there would be no violation, no reason for the Secret Service to look into it.
All right. Ms. Rahman, would you respond to the same question, especially the second half of the question, which agencies do you believe need to be at the forefront of the federal government's work on virtual currencies?
Starting with that question then first, I think the Department of Justice recognized a few years ago that a joint effort was needed, and the FBI set up and led the Virtual Currency Emerging Threats Working Group, which is now the working group that my colleagues here and many other agencies participate in. It's borne out to be very fruitful. It's a forum that allows all of the agencies that you'd want to be at the table, the Treasury Department, our law enforcement agencies, even within the Department of Justice, the FBI, DEA, and other agencies within the Department of Justice's prosecutors. We have U.S. attorneys' offices and two sections of the criminal division, the asset forfeiture and money laundering section, and the computer crime and intellectual property section participating, OFAC, IRS, and a number of other agencies here in the United States that we think are necessary participants are in fact participants. We also have foreign law enforcement that participates in that group, including the National Crime Agency in the UK. And these are, I think, the most important agencies to be at the table. That covers the waterfront in terms of regulations and regulatory enforcement and criminal law enforcement. There's, of course, room for improvement, and we're always looking for additional participants. And even, in fact, last week, there were additional participants that were invited to join that working group. I think it's an excellent...
From other countries or from within this country?
I think, well, both. But even last week, we thought of an additional domestic agency that should be at the table, and we've invited them to participate. And so I think it's going to be an evolving process. It's proven so helpful thus far, and I think we are intending for that to continue to be an important forum in which we can talk jointly about what the emerging threats are, what each of our agencies can do to coordinate across the government, both here and abroad. As for the regulations and the laws that cover virtual currencies, I feel confident that currently are criminal statutes that we have used in our prosecutions thus far have been effective tools. Our money laundering statutes have been very effective in our ability to prosecute e-gold, Liberty Reserve, for example. Our substantive criminal statutes, such as our drug trafficking statutes and murder statutes, have been effective thus far in being able to charge the administrator of Silk Road. And our money transmitter statutes, which is 18 U.S.C. 1960, has also been used to prosecute Liberty Reserve and some of its principals, for example. And so I do think that we have the statutory tools, for the most part, that we as prosecutors need to get at this kind of criminal activity. But I will say that the Department of Justice over the last few years has been proposing and pushing updates to our money laundering statutes through the Proceeds of Crime Act and related pieces of legislation. And those changes are ones that we continue to support. Money laundering statutes have been on the books for a long time, and they've been effective, but they can be updated. And we've proposed over the years several updates that we continue to support.
Shasky?
Sure. Taking the questions in turn. FinCEN has never opined and still is not opining on whether virtual currency is a real currency or a commodity, as those questions are outside of our purview. We are the anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing regulator for the federal government. And so our regulations spoke to that and only that. And we tried to make that clear in our guidance this last March. But this country, like all countries, has an interest not only in protecting our financial system from money laundering and terrorist finance, but also protecting consumers from fraud, collecting taxes, protecting investors, ensuring economic stability, all things that are a part of our regulatory system but outside of the purview of FinCEN. And so to the extent that this body or others feel that it's appropriate to take those considerations into account with regard to virtual currency, we would look forward to working with them to make sure we're as coordinated as possible in our actions.
All right, thank you. You all know about the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and one of the most people, I guess a lot of people in this country have heard them. Most people probably have no idea what GAO is or what they do, but they're, as we know, a watchdog, and they're sort of the congressional watchdog to make sure that we're minding our P's and Q's in the federal government in a lot of different ways. And the way we run our operations, trying to do it in a cost-effective way, broad operations, widely diverse operations. Every other year, the GAO comes up with something they call their high-risk list. And when I first heard about the high-risk list, I said, what is that? And they said it's a high-risk list is a whole list of activities designated by or identified by General Accountability Office to waste money. Every now and then I talk to constituents. We talk about what we're doing to try to reduce the budget deficit. And I have people say, I don't want to pay any more taxes, but if I'm going to, I just don't want you to waste my money. And one of the things that GAO does, working with the Congress, is to identify ways to spend money more effectively, and also to collect monies that are owed to the Treasury more effectively. And it's that second half of that function I want to talk about. The GAO every other year reports to us, along with the help of the IRS, on something called tax gap. Monies that are owed, hundreds of billions of dollars that are owed to the Treasury, but not being collected. In some cases, we have a pretty good idea who owes the money, the entities that owe the money. But it's a lot of money that goes uncollected. And I'd like to say that number is going down, but unfortunately, to my knowledge, it isn't, at least not just. But what I want to do is, with that as background, just ask you this. When I think about the new types of currencies, I wonder how they fit in to the tax system here in our country. And as you know, we just talked about it, GAO, but they issued a report, I think it was earlier this year, maybe it was May of this year, in which follows my line of thinking and assesses that virtual currencies could present a real vulnerability and actually make worse what is already a difficult situation. They recommended that the IRS find relatively low-cost ways to provide guidance to taxpayers on the basic tax reporting requirements for virtual currencies. And let me just ask, do you know the current status of that guidance, and what could we expect it to include, and when can we expect it to be released? And I would say either Ms. Shasky or Mr. Rahman, if you could tackle that one, I'd be grateful.
I'd be happy to begin with that one. So first of all, as the Financial Intelligence Unit for the United States, one thing FinCEN does after it collects all of the information that our financial institutions provide to us is we make that available to our partners in law enforcement, not only for the purpose of enforcing our criminal laws, but also for the collection of taxes. And so we have a very close and long-standing relationship with the IRS, both on the criminal side and the civil side, to help them do just that. In fact, this very last week, we were meeting with them on this very topic, virtual currencies, and how to think of that in our joint work. Something that I know they're taking very seriously. When it comes to guidance on virtual currency for taxpayers, I know there was the GAO report that suggested that IRS come out with some guidance, because there may perhaps be some question as to how to treat different uses of virtual currency for purposes of our taxing regime. And while I don't know the details and would have to refer you to IRS to get into great detail, what I can tell you, and I do know, is that they are working diligently on such guidance, and that
Any idea when we might expect to see it?
My understanding is that the GAO report may have set forth some deadlines. I think it's usually 60 to 90 days. I can tell you they're actively working on it, and it's at the forefront of their minds. I think it'll be very useful guidance for the taxpayers when it comes out.
Ms. Rahman, do you want to add or take away anything from what Ms. Shasky said?
Certainly not take away anything. I defer to the IRS on the status of the guidance, and I am not personally aware of the status of the guidance. I will say that the Department of Justice was very aware of the GAO report. We took an interest in its findings, and we've been in discussions with the IRS about some of the findings in the GAO report.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Shasky, I think you said earlier, you might say earlier, that FinCEN did not opine on whether or not virtual currencies are currencies or commodities. And I would just ask of you, who do you think should be making that decision? And second question would be, beyond who do you think should be making that decision, do we need that definition to be made in order to enforce the laws and regulations?
I'm not sure I know who should ultimately make that decision. I do know it's outside of the...
You think it should be Mr. Lauer over here?
I'm guessing it should not be Mr. Lauer. In terms of the legality of various things, I'm sure that Congress has a role in determining that. When we start talking about commodities, the CFTC comes to mind. When we talk about securities, the SEC. Regardless of who should be making those determinations, our focus at FinCEN was, we know that virtual currency currently exists. We know that it is being used to transact payments. We know that it has been exploited by some pretty serious criminal organizations, and we want to protect the U.S. financial system, as we're mandated to do, from those illicit actors, from laundering or moving money for the purposes of terrorism through our U.S. financial system. And so our entire focus has been on how can we best do that under our current regulatory scheme. The nice thing is that the regulatory scheme that we have in place has the flexibility in it to change as the landscape changes. So in other words, if some part of the industry were to ultimately be defined to come under the SEC or the CFTC, our AML, our anti-money laundering regulations, also apply to those areas of the industry. And so regardless, we're going to make sure that we're taking every mitigating step we can to prevent illicit actors from operating through the U.S. financial system.
Okay. Mr. Lauer, let me focus a question on you, and maybe, if you like, Ms. Rahman. As I think you're both probably aware, A few weeks after the Silk Road website was taken down by federal law enforcement, a new Silk Road website popped up in its place. And it's hardly alone. Numerous other similar marketplaces exist on the dark web, selling drugs, selling weapons, selling child pornography, and in some cases market for higher services. Whether or not these are real marketplaces or simply some scam artist's idea of a sick joke, it obviously makes people worried. It makes people concerned. How do we develop a strategy? How do we develop a strategy to deal with these sites? And are there particular characteristics of these sites that make it more difficult for law enforcement to respond? And would you respond to that, Mr. Lowery, and then maybe Ms. Rahman?
Absolutely. So the online sites, the Secret Service in our investigations, once again, we believe there are 3 infrastructures in place that facilitate the online crimes. The Silk Road type criminal forums. One of the Secret Service specialties are on the criminal forums, Eastern European based predominantly, that specialize in the large-scale trafficking of stolen financial data and what have you. So there are other of these websites that specialize in specific crimes. The other part of the infrastructure is the digital currencies. The use of digital currencies, predominantly the digital currencies that fall outside of the guidance of FinCEN or outside of U.S. law, or in countries that obviously, as I said earlier, have less regulatory controls. And the third is what we call we refer to as bulletproof hosters.
Referred to as what?
Bulletproof hosting. It's a criminal organization, criminal individual who specifically sets up business in a country with very little regulatory or aggressive law enforcement and provides a platform for attacks to be launched against the U.S. criminal infrastructure. So the Secret Service attacks the problem strategically. We are always looking to identify the individual behind a specific crime, the intruder, the large-scale vendor of stolen personal data, or what have you. And at times it may be that if we can identify a forum or a digital currency that is within legal reach, within reach of U.S. law enforcement, case in point, Liberty Reserve or eGold, then it makes strategic sense to take that out of the equation. And it disrupts the criminal organization for strategic reasons, quite honestly, usually to facilitate the arrest of other individuals we're looking at.
All right, thank you. Ms. Rahman, you want to add anything to that statement?
I think the challenge that you're pointing to sometimes really results from anonymity, and it results from many criminals migrating to hidden services on the Internet.
Migrating to what?
To hidden services on the Internet. And that has been a challenge for law enforcement, but as you've seen from the results that have that we've been able to achieve in the last several years, I think we've been able to keep pace with that, and we've been able to develop tools and strategies to address it. Although it is, I think, as you mentioned, it can be frustrating to the public to see another website pop up after one that seems similar to it just having been taken down. I do think, as Mr. Lowery said, that it's incredibly important for us to be taking those steps, not just to disrupt that particular organization, but to send a message to the users of those websites that that they cannot trust those types of websites, that law enforcement is watching, and it is not, in fact, anonymous, and it is not, in fact, immune from investigation. And that is an important message to send. All of us in law enforcement who pay attention to the results of these takedowns know that the community is aware, the criminal community is aware when we take these actions. It's important that we do so. It's important that we put the wrongdoers in prison when they deserve it, and it's important for us to put these organizations out of business, and I think we've been able to do that.
Well, that was a very encouraging addition to Mr. Lowery's response. Thank you. I have another question on domestic job creation that I'm going to direct to Ms. Shasky. But before I do, my last question will probably follow right after that, and then we'll introduce our second panel. Take maybe a short recess and introduce our second panel after that. But sometimes I ask a panel that's before us, when we're trying to figure out how to develop some consensus to address a significant challenge to our country, one of the things I'll do, you were very kind to present an opening statement, and I appreciate very much your clear, straightforward responses to the questions I've asked. But I want to ask each of you to take a minute or two maybe to give a closing statement and to reflect on what you said, what others have said, some of the questions that we've asked, and some of what you heard your colleagues on the panel to say. So just be thinking about that. And while they're thinking about that, Ms. Shasky, I'm going to ask you this question about domestic job creation. As you know, there's been some concern that virtual currency businesses might leave the U.S. and move overseas to jurisdictions with a less strict regulatory framework. And what, if anything, can the U.S. Do to try to keep businesses in this country? What are we doing that seems to make sense? What maybe more should we do? And along those same lines, is FinCEN engaging with international partners on regulation of virtual currencies? It sounds like we are, but if you could expand on that, I'd be grateful. So those two questions, please.
Sure. So first, in terms of keeping business in the United States, I guess I'd say that if business is going to leave the United States based on perceived or actual regulatory burden, I at least believe that they're going to find that gain short-lived. Every country, as I mentioned earlier, has an interest in protecting its financial system from illicit actors who would launder money or move money on behalf of terrorist organizations, in collecting taxes and protecting investors and protecting consumers from fraud and ensuring a stable economy. And so if this payment system, this virtual currency payment system about which we're talking today is going to survive and be a real player, a significant player in the financial system, regulation both at home and abroad is going to catch up because it has to. And so our challenge here is to have smart regulation that both mitigates the risks while at the same time minimizing the burdens. I feel confident that at least in the AML CFT
what does that stand for?
Anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing realm, we have managed to do that and met that challenge. I think that's going to be borne out over time. So I think the innovation and the jobs will stay in the U.S., or at least come back to the U.S. In terms of working with our international partners to ensure that we have a kind of consistent regulatory framework on the anti-money laundering side worldwide, the Financial Action Task Force is the international standard-setting body and does a good job of ensuring that countries around the world have the laws and the regulations in place. My understanding is that they're interested in taking up this issue at the FATF, as it is known. What I can tell you for sure is that my counterparts abroad have been reaching out to us quite a bit to find out what we're doing in this regulatory space. We managed in this country to be able to act a bit quicker than some of our colleagues because we had the broad definitions and were able to fit virtual currency within our pre-existing regime. Germany was able to do the same thing, so they too already have regulations on the books. Other countries are trying to figure out how they can catch up.
All right, thank you. Now, while you think about the answer to this last question that we're going to let Mr. Lowry and Ms. Rahman go ahead and just give us just a brief closing statement. Ms. Rahman, you want to go first?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. It's encouraging from the law enforcement standpoint to have interest in these kinds of issues because they aren't easy. Although we've had many successes, we've clearly had challenges too, and it is helpful when we have interest from people like yourself, and it's helpful when we have questions asked of us like, what can we do to help? There's always something that we can do better, and it's helpful to have these dialogues. I also think it's encouraging that I have colleagues like the ones that are sitting next to me who have been willing to work together on these emerging threats. I think we've all approached it in the same way, which is that virtual currencies in and of themselves are not illegal. We've all recognized that innovation is important, and we've all recognized that, like criminals around have done for ages. This will be another vehicle through which criminals may try to launder proceeds or commit additional crimes. I feel confident that we have the tools that we need to address those threats. And I feel confident that we have the will to address those threats, but we need to keep pace with what is going to come, and we will remain vigilant. We intend to be as aggressive in the years to come as we have in the last several years. Virtual currencies didn't just sneak up on us. As I said in my opening statement, we brought our first indictment in 2007, and so we assume that these kinds of threats will continue to emerge and change and evolve, and we intend to keep pace.
All right, thank you. That's a pretty good closing statement. You should do this for a living.
It just so happens I do.
That's good. I think you found the right job. Mr. Lowry.
I would echo those statements.
In fact, I think each of you have.
But in closing, as a DHS law enforcement agency and a longstanding regional defender of the U.S. critical infrastructure, I know the Secret Service, working with our partners in law enforcement as well as in the prosecution and FinCEN and our international partners, will continue to work strategically to remove the gravest threats to our infrastructure. It's going to take consistent awareness of the growing threat. It's going to be, we're going to have to adapt as we always have, and we're going to have to hurdle the international issues and what have you, working together overseas. And I do know U.S. law enforcement is very aggressive and also very collaborative with our foreign partners because we realize that this issue can't be taken care of just by ourselves. We will continue to work as we respond to these threats. We, as a part of DHS, will continue to work to disseminate the threats through DHS and through our electronic crimes task forces, through our various partners, to ensure that the remaining 16 CIKRs throughout for the country's infrastructure are provided the greatest level of protection. And we believe firmly that aggressive law enforcement is a strong part of cybersecurity, which will benefit the nation as a whole.
Thank you. Ms. Shasky, the last word.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I'd like to thank you, as my colleagues did, for convening this very important hearing. I heard a banker, a CEO of a fairly large bank, say recently that having the privilege to be a financial institution and be a part of the global financial system is just that, it's a privilege. And there's a reason why countries and jurisdictions ask you to be licensed to be one of those financial institutions, because it also comes with great responsibility. You have great power in your hands as a part of the financial system, and particularly in this country with the financial system we have in the United States. And so while innovation is a wonderful thing, and innovation in the financial services industry is incredibly important, it does come with obligations to have that entree and be able to be a part of the U.S. financial system. And one of those obligations is helping to protect that system from illicit actors. So we believe that the regulations in place have met that balance of mitigating the risks while minimizing the burden. In essence, we're asking virtual currency exchangers and administrators to do three things. Register with FinCEN. It's an online form and it's free. Put in place AML protections, controls in place to harden yourself to the likelihood that bad actors will take advantage of your system. And maintain records and provide certain reports to FinCEN, including suspicious activity reports. It's something that many other players in the financial system already do, from the smallest mom-and-pop check casher that's on the corner, probably just up the street here, to the biggest of the global financial institutions. They've all found a way to offer their services while maintaining those same protections. And so that's what we're asking of virtual currency providers. We believe it's reasonable, given that we've seen that virtual currency has, in fact, been exploited by some pretty serious actors. That being said, FinCEN is constantly engaged in outreach to industry and have been engaged in outreach with the virtual currency industry. We try to bring different parts of the industry together so that they can learn from each other the practices, best practices for hardening themselves to illicit finance, and to share the information we collect from them back with them so that they can become even better at protecting the U.S. financial system. So at the end of the day, we hope we have that balance right. We think we have that balance right, but we're committed to continuing the discussions both with industry to see if that's right, as well as our colleagues on the law enforcement side. Thank you.
Thank you. This has been a thought-provoking presentation and discussion. It's been encouraging as well. This is probably a stretch of an analogy, but I'm going to try to make it fit. I serve on a committee called Environment and Public Works, and we wrestle all the time with the need to clean up our environment and to put in place the kind of regulatory structure, legislative structure, combination of laws and regulations and enforcement that enable us to breathe the air and drink the water and do so without fear. I always like to say you don't have to make it. We don't have to make a choice. It's a false choice to say we have to choose between a stronger economy and a clean environment. I think that's a false choice. And one of the questions that's been rattling around in my mind, and as we've drilled down on this subject, is it possible to reap the benefits, including the economic benefits, of this virtual currency, but at the same time cleaning up the kind of misbehavior, criminal behavior that we all know is out there and is a concern to all of us. And just as I'm become convinced over the years it's possible to have a stronger economy and a cleaner environment, I'm encouraged that maybe it's possible to have the benefits of a virtual currency or virtual currencies, and to actually be able to not facilitate, but to hold down the kind of criminal activity and criminal involvement that we talked about here today. So thank you for giving us both sides of the story. And we're going to have, I suspect, a chance to work with you all some more. And my hope is that you'll feel free to come back and tell us informally or formally where the legislative branch of our government needs to be doing some things to make sure that whatever potential there is here for our economy and for consumers is actually realized. And while we tamp down on that illegal behavior, criminal behavior, we all want to eliminate. So I'm going to just call just a very short recess while we change up the cards. I'm going to need to take a phone call from one of my colleagues, and we'll probably resume in about 2 minutes. But thank you all very, very much for joining us. Thank you. Now we'll just take a short recess. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to find your seats. Looks like we have our witnesses lined up. And we thank you for joining us today. I'm told we're still going to start voting at 5:30, so that'll probably be a hard stop for this panel. But let me take just a moment, if I could, to introduce each member of this panel. Distinguished witnesses. It's my notes here say distinguished witnesses, so thank you. First witness is Ernie Allen, who's the President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Mr. Allen also serves as co-chair of the Digital Economy Task Force, which was developed to focus on the benefits and risks surrounding the digital economy, and is led jointly by the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children and Thomson Reuters. Our next witness is Patrick Mark, and General Counsel for Bitcoin Foundation. The Bitcoin Foundation works to standardize, to protect, and promote Bitcoin. Mr. Mark is also the principal and founder of Engage Legal. His expertise extends across the legal and regulatory issues governing the use of Bitcoin, virtual economies, and alternative payment systems. Previously, Mr. Mark worked in a business and legal affairs at the tech company Big Door, as an attorney at a DC-based law firm, and also as an international investigative journalist. Our third witness is Jeremy Allaire. Is it Allaire? Allaire. Mr. Allaire is the founder and CEO of Circle Internet Financial, a startup company focused on promoting mainstream adoption of virtual currencies. Serial internet entrepreneur Mr. Allaire also serves as founder and CEO of Bright Cove, one of the largest online video platforms in the United States. And our final witness is Jerry Brito. Mr. Brito is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at the George Mason University and director of the Technology Policy Program. Mr. Brito also serves as an adjunct professor of law at George Mason University. His research focuses on technology and internet policy, copyright, and on the regulatory process. Good afternoon, and our welcome to each of you. Your entire testimonies will be made part of the record, and as I said to the first group, you're welcome to summarize if you'd like, and try to keep your comments about 7 minutes. If you go way beyond that, I'll have to rein you in. Otherwise, we'll be just fine. Mr. Allen, why don't you lead us off? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Carper. As you mentioned, we have launched a digital economy task force with Thomson Reuters, the global media and information company. That was created as a result of a conference we brought together in June with private sector leaders and government officials to look at this larger problem. The task force that is working on this issue today includes the Bitcoin Foundation, the Tor Project, the Gates Foundation, the Brookings Institution, the Cato Institute, Vital Voices, law enforcement leaders from around the world, and many others. Our goal is to bring people together and work toward reasonable, balanced, effective solutions that protect the promise of the digital economy while addressing its misuse. And our task force will issue its final report in February. Let me begin by saying we are enthusiastic about the potential of virtual currencies and the digital economy for social good, particularly in helping to bring about financial inclusion for the 2.5 billion adults on the planet today without access to banks, credit cards, and the mainstream financial system. However, as you've pointed out today, there are risks. Our primary concern is the migration of child pornography, child sexual exploitation, trafficking, and other criminal enterprises to this new economy. And we believe it's happening for 3 primary reasons. The first is anonymity. The second is that this is an economy that belongs to no nation and is overseen by no central bank. And thirdly, we believe that most countries have not yet begun to apply existing law and regulations to virtual currencies at the exchange level, the point at which virtual currencies are traded for dollars, euros, pounds, or yen. Over the past year, I have consulted with law enforcement experts and financial experts around the world about this issue, and they advise as it relates to our core concern, which is the exploitation of children, that child pornography is currently being created and disseminated using anonymizing technologies and using virtual currencies for payment. They hasten to add that it is at a lower threshold of volume than drugs and other criminal goods. However, they call the use of these technologies for child pornography significant because they principally involve the actual producers of the content, who are producing content using anonymizing technology and using virtual currencies for payment. In August, the Irish owner of Freedom Hosting, which the FBI had called the largest facilitator of child pornography on the planet, was arrested. Freedom Hosting maintains servers for a number of the so-called deep web child pornography sites, Lolita City, Pedo Empire, The Love Zone, and others, all of which accepted digital currencies for payment. To shut down Freedom Hosting, law enforcement exploited a vulnerability in the site to penetrate its anonymity and expose the IP addresses of the users. Regarding Bitcoin, all the transactions are visible and transparent. The challenge for law enforcement is to go from that transaction to an actual person. The primary challenge that we have learned in our consultations with global law enforcement today is growing Internet anonymity. A recent headline read, "There's a secret Internet for drug dealers, assassins, and pedophiles." This so-called deep web includes sites like Silk Road, but it also includes sites for the purchase of weapons and counterfeit currencies and stolen credit cards and assassins and child pornography sites. All of these sites accept digital currencies for payment. What I hear most from law enforcement today is frustration. The primary investigative technique I've been told that law enforcement around the world is using to investigate these operations is infiltration. But infiltration is expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's often ineffective. And while there's some arrests, the research indicates that most of the arrests are of those who use the anonymizing technology improperly and leave a trail. They connect to a non-anonymous IP address, providing a trail to follow. And even the Silk Road arrest involved an offender who made a series of mistakes that made it possible for him to be identified. My concern is, with the absence of existing law enforcement tools, we're not catching the truly sophisticated, the most high-risk organized criminal offenders. Through our task force, one of the things that we're doing is exploring new techniques, including clustering Bitcoin transactions to identify patterns. And we hope to learn from the techniques that were utilized by law enforcement to penetrate Freedom Hosting. For the future, the pace of innovation will quicken, there will be new technologies, and the intensity of the effort to achieve total Internet anonymity will increase. You asked, what can Congress do? I think there are four things. First, you can ensure that existing law and regulation focusing on the point at which virtual currencies are being exchanged for conventional currencies are used. Secondly, you can press for global cooperation. Digital economy funds flow globally, network to network, not nation to nation. This is a problem that the U.S. government cannot solve alone. Thirdly, you can ensure that the response of government to this fragile, emerging, high-risk but high-reward area is not so draconian that the effect is simply to push these new enterprises out of the United States into countries where there's little or no regulation. And finally, you can help us address the core challenge, Internet anonymity. For all of its importance in protecting political dissidents, journalists, and others, we are very concerned that an environment not be allowed to foster in which child exploiters and traffickers can operate with no risk unless they make a mistake. 3 years ago, the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, in her remarks on a free internet said, on the one hand, anonymity protects the exploitation of children. On the other hand, anonymity protects the free expression of opposition to repressive governments. She added we should err on the side of openness while recognizing there are going to be exceptions. That's the challenge, Mr. Chairman, is to determine how anonymous the Internet can be from the perspective of government and law enforcement around the world. We feel that absolute Internet anonymity is a prescription for catastrophe. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Very good testimony. Mr. Merck, welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Carper. I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Patrick Merck. I am General Counsel for the Bitcoin Foundation. I'm a founding member of the Bitcoin Foundation, and I have been an executive in legal and business development for a number of digital currency companies. Additionally, I serve on the board of directors for the BitGive Foundation, a fledgling charitable organization for the Bitcoin community. The Bitcoin Foundation is a member-driven nonprofit representing a global constituency of business and individuals contributing to the overall Bitcoin ecosystem. Our membership is comprised of many of the top companies, entrepreneurs, and technologists working to make Bitcoin a success. The Foundation's mission is to promote, protect, and standardize the use of distributed, decentralized currencies and to free people to transact on their own terms in the global economy. Having said that, there is no Bitcoin company that manages or controls the software or its operation. The software is built and maintained by a community of volunteer open-source software engineers and a distributed network of transaction processing, often referred to as mining. At its most basic level, Bitcoin is an internet protocol. It's like email for money. The Bitcoin protocol operates a decentralized store of value and an open and transparent payment network that is secure, efficient, and low cost. The Bitcoin network can operate without any third-party intermediaries and is a highly innovative global financial system unto itself. In the near future, the Bitcoin protocol will also facilitate advanced payment services, and experiments are currently underway to provide additional non-financial services like property management and identity verification. Open and participatory systems like Bitcoin will produce many economic and social benefits. These systems can reduce exploitation of vulnerable populations the world over and here in the U.S. by providing a safe and private store of wealth in addition to a global transaction network that cannot be corrupted or abused by those who would seek to exploit or harm others. Financial exclusion is a U.S. problem. It is not just a problem for the Global South. There is a rising tide of unbanked and underbanked people right within our borders. This is important because access to financial services directly correlates to increases in dignity, liberty, and self-determination. Bitcoin can help move people trapped in a cash-based informal economy into a globally connected digital economy. At the same time, we acknowledge that, like any technology, there is a potential for abuse of this system. Bitcoin can be used for illicit purposes, and the law enforcement community may have to develop new methodologies for interdicting and investigating criminal activity on the network. This does not mean that it will be any harder to prevent the misuse of the Bitcoin network than existing financial systems. As we heard in earlier testimony, in Bitcoin's short history, law enforcement and regulatory agencies have had a string of notable successes already. Rather than belabor the overwrought headlines about misuse of Bitcoin and the digital economy, we should be congratulating the law enforcement community on their hard work and skill in adapting investigative techniques to an increasingly digital and openly networked world. Keeping the Bitcoin network safe is all of our responsibility, and industry-led efforts are underway to help prevent abuse. Like you, Mr. Chairman, we are looking beyond the Silk Road. When the alleged operator of that black market website was arrested, the markets expressed relief and optimism with a long and sustained rally in the price of Bitcoin. Decentralized currencies like Bitcoin have a different risk profile from centralized currency systems. Central control of the transaction ledger allows bad actors to shroud their activities. Decentralized systems with open ledgers are inherently transparent and may prove too difficult for use in any large-scale and sustained illicit activity. As we address law enforcement concerns, we must bear in mind that because of this open and transparent architecture, we need to consider the privacy of law-abiding individuals. As it turns out, the blockchain, which is Bitcoin's public ledger system, may be so revealing that the larger problem with Bitcoin is not anonymity for criminals, but the difficulty law-abiding people have maintaining their own privacy. Bitcoin is not some magical cloaking device that simply allows criminals free rein, nor does Bitcoin pose a unique or unsolvable threat to the law enforcement and regulatory community. The use of Bitcoin is not unregulated. In fact, Bitcoin service providers operate in heavily regulated business environments with deeply entrenched competitors. For these potential competitors, be they banks, payment networks, financial service companies, Bitcoin also represents an opportunity for them to start innovating again. These institutions already have a deep understanding of the controls and risk management necessary to safely handle Bitcoin transactions and secure consumer Bitcoin accounts. Instead, what we've seen is a chilling effect through the banking industry as Bitcoin companies try and gain bank accounts. The United States has a strong interest in maintaining its place as a global leader in developing cutting-edge technology and spreading individual freedom and liberty around the world. The digital economy is poised to be a driver of significant job creation and economic growth. Fostering the development of legitimate Bitcoin business in the U.S. also is the best preventive measure we can take to keep good actors in the system. Applying consistent rules and regulations that encourage technological experimentation is critical to a vibrant entrepreneurial community. This committee's work is undeniably helpful in charting a safe and sane regulatory environment for the digital economy in general and Bitcoin specifically. As one entrepreneur and member of the Bitcoin Foundation put it succinctly, if you give us clear rules, we will follow them and we will build jobs. Development of clear rules appears to be happening faster at the federal level than at the state level. Having said that, we are encouraged by early signs of leadership from states like California and Georgia. We believe a healthy and respectful dialogue between key stakeholders will help ensure that the substantial benefits of the digital economy are met while mitigating many of the risks. In particular, we would like to thank FinCEN for opening up a dialogue with the Bitcoin community and for demonstrating leadership on this issue at both the federal and state level. The Bitcoin Foundation looks forward to continuing this open dialogue and thanks the committee for allowing us to participate in this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Merck. Mr. Allaire.
Chairman Carper, thank you for hearing my testimony this afternoon. My name is Jeremy Allaire, and I'm the founder and CEO of Circle Internet Financial, a recently launched financial services company aimed at facilitating payments and money transfers using global digital currency such as Bitcoin. I've been building Internet software platforms and online services companies for 20 years, having founded and helped to lead multiple global public companies with products used by hundreds of millions of consumers and hundreds of thousands of businesses globally. I'm here to testify because I believe that digital currency represents one of the most important technical and economic innovations of our time. Specifically, digital currency introduces advancements in electronic payments and money transfers, potentially materially lowering costs for businesses around the world, decreasing fraud risk for consumers and merchants, increasing consumer privacy, and expanding the market for consumer financial products on a worldwide basis. As this technology moves from early adopters into mainstream acceptance, it is critical that federal and state governments understand how Bitcoin fits into existing regulatory guidelines and how to apply them to digital currency. These should uphold consumer protections associated with fraud and privacy risks, ensure that criminals and bad actors find it increasingly difficult to utilize these platforms, and provide income tax clarity to consumers and businesses that conduct business using digital currency. It's very clear that over the past 20 years, the Internet has been at the center of global economic innovation. Open platforms have transformed communications, media, software, education, commerce, and retail. But for a variety of reasons, the technology and business models around finance has been insulated from similar transformations. This same open platform approach in digital currency, specifically Bitcoin, presents an opportunity for the same level of innovation and advancement in forms of currency, trade, and payments that we've seen brought to bear on other industries. I don't think there's much debate that we need to see innovation and transformation in banking and finance, not just reform and remediation. Specifically, our payment systems are inefficient and very much built upon systems and processes that predate the Internet. The result is higher costs for consumers, lower margins for business, and less efficient economic interaction. And in many cases, our financial systems have excluded enormous bases of consumers who remain unbanked or underbanked. The combination of ubiquitous, Internet-connected mobile devices and digital currency presents a tremendous opportunity to expand access to financial services on a worldwide basis. Payments and money transfers are still operating in the pre-Internet era. Today, we can communicate to almost anyone in the world, including in video format, at no cost. We have instant access to an enormous amount of the world's knowledge, also effectively at no cost. We have instant access to more media than we ever imagined was possible, again, almost at no cost. Yet to send money between friends and family, whether across the table or across the planet, takes days and costs a significant amount in transaction fees. To accept payments, merchants must bear significant fraud risk. Consumer privacy is often threatened, and likewise it takes days for a merchant to actually receive money from an electronic payment, not to mention the widely perceived high costs of transaction fees. So what are we at Circle specifically doing about this? At Circle, we're building online services for consumers and businesses to be able to easily use digital currency, and specifically Bitcoin. For consumers, we intend to enable them to easily purchase, store, send, receive, and make payments using Bitcoin. And for businesses, we're providing tools to help them easily accept digital currency payments. We're fully committed to complying with all applicable laws and regulations and establishing comprehensive risk management protocols. We've registered with FinCEN as a money transmitter and are actively seeking appropriate licenses from U.S. state financial authorities. We're developing our platforms to provide very high levels of security for our users and employing industry-leading approaches to customer identity verification, fraud remediation, and anti-money laundering, designed in partnership with leading regulatory advisors and experts. I want to talk for a minute, though, about some of the risks inherent in digital currency platforms such as Bitcoin. First of all, as has been made amply clear from earlier testimony, I want to emphasize that I believe that U.S. regulators and law enforcement are justifiably focused on the potential use of digital currencies to finance criminal activities, including terrorism. But in addition to FinCEN's guidance and the appropriate requirement that Bitcoin operators implement Bank Secrecy Act provisions, it is also a risk if the government doesn't support innovative companies gaining access to U.S. banking institutions, which will drive companies offshore and overseas. Another risk is that businesses' adoption of digital currency will be hampered without clarification from the IRS on income generated from sales denominated in digital currency, and such guidance is also needed to thwart potential tax evaders. Without clear guidance on consumer protections required of Bitcoin operators, consumers and businesses could be defrauded through inadequate systems and risk management procedures around customer funds. Another risk is that the United States falls behind in this critical emerging economic innovation. Regulatory uncertainty could hold back American companies from participating in driving digital currency innovation. Indeed, today, a Bitcoin exchange in China has become the largest single trading exchange in the world, followed by exchanges in Japan and Europe. We need to uphold and support our incredible history in America of supporting technical innovation and entrepreneurship. In terms of U.S. regulation, it appears to me that federal and state regulators seem to have ample statutory authority to adopt regulations and take enforcement actions as necessary to protect consumers and ensure responsible conduct in the world of Bitcoin commerce, and that enforcement actions to date have been constructive. We stand ready to assist them in their ongoing efforts to adapt their regulatory tools to new digital currency. I believe we're at the forefront of another 20-year journey of Internet-led transformation, this time in our global financial systems, and there's a real opportunity to foster that economic change while simultaneously putting in place the safeguards that only government can enable. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my prepared testimony. I'd be happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you, sir. That was a very, very helpful testimony. Thanks. Mr. Brito, please proceed. Welcome. We're delighted that you're here.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me here today. We're here today to discuss virtual currencies in general, but it is Bitcoin in particular that has so many interested in this topic. But online virtual currencies are nothing new. They have existed for decades, from World of Warcraft Gold to Facebook credits to eGold, and neither are online payment systems new. PayPal, Visa, Western Union Pay, these are all examples. So what is it about Bitcoin and similar cryptographic currencies that make them unique? Whatever one may think about Bitcoin's prospects for enduring value, it is safe to say that it is a remarkable technical achievement. Bitcoin is the world's first completely decentralized digital currency, and it's the decentralized part of that sentence that is really unique. Prior to Bitcoin's invention in 2009, online currencies or payment systems had to be managed by a central authority, whether it was Facebook issuing Facebook credits or PayPal ensuring that transactions between its customers were reconciled. However, by solving a long-standing conundrum in computer science known as the double spending problem, Bitcoin, for the first time, makes possible transactions online that are person-to-person, without the need for an intermediary between them, just like cash. This technical breakthrough presents potential benefits for consumers and the economy, as well as challenges to law enforcement. For example, because there is no central authority in Bitcoin transactions, there are little to no fees associated with those transactions, which especially benefits small businesses and price-sensitive consumers. And because Bitcoin is not a proprietary platform run by a single company, but instead it's an open network, entrepreneurs need no permission to experiment or to innovate new products and services. On the flip side, law enforcement has long relied on financial intermediaries to help them detect, prevent, and investigate illegal transactions. Because Bitcoin's transactions can have no intermediaries, and because Bitcoin transactions are not necessarily tied to identities, it is not surprising that we have seen Bitcoin employed in criminal transactions. In particular, Bitcoin has been used for the sale of drugs and in malware that holds one's data hostage. It's also not difficult to imagine how the technology could be employed in money laundering. Emerging technologies often present both great potential benefits as well as real risks. For example, 3D printing can be used to cheaply make prostheses and life-saving medical devices, but also undetectable firearms. Domestic commercial drones have the potential to revolutionize agriculture and shipping, but could also be used for stalking. The challenge for policymakers is to address the risks posed by emerging technologies while doing no harm to the innovative potential of that technology. In many cases where emerging technologies pose risks, there are already laws and regulations of general applicability that address many of those risks without the need for new laws targeted at the specific technology. This is the case with Bitcoin. While Bitcoin transactions do not require intermediaries, one must still acquire Bitcoins by exchanging dollars, and merchants that accept Bitcoins will very often use Bitcoin payment processors. Indeed, there's a fast-growing ecosystem of startup exchanges, payment processors, and wallet and escrow services that make up Bitcoin's burgeoning infrastructure. Each of these are already subject to regulation as money transmitters, including state licensing and FinCEN registration, as well as Know Your Customer and Suspicious Activity Report requirements. More to the point, serious criminals looking to hide their tracks are more likely to choose a centralized virtual currency run by an intermediary willing to lie to regulators for a fee, rather than a decentralized currency like Bitcoin that, as a technical matter, must make a record of every transaction, even if pseudonymously. While the online black market Silk Road, which used Bitcoins, is estimated to have generated less than $200 million in drug sales, the centralized digital currency Liberty Reserve is believed to have laundered more than $6 billion related to credit card fraud, identity theft, computer hacking, and child pornography. The reason Liberty Reserve, and not Bitcoin, was the payment system of choice for criminals online is that it was designed and managed by its creators to avoid Know Your Customer and reporting rules and to evade subpoena. As a result, the path forward that can best confront risks while ensuring that we can reap Bitcoin's beneficial potential is to allow the Bitcoin network and its surrounding infrastructure to develop by making sure that entrepreneurial innovators can easily comply with existing regulation. The alternative, promulgating special regulations for virtual currencies or otherwise making it more costly to operate legitimately in this space, could have two unintended consequences. First, It might mean ceding the network to exclusively illegal use and foregoing any visibility that law enforcement could otherwise gain into the activities of compliant firms. And second, the United States could lose its head start in what may be the next breakthrough industry if it establishes a regulatory regime that hampers Bitcoin, while other countries, like China and Canada and Germany, look for ways to develop workable regulatory frameworks for Bitcoin. Finally, as regulatory and law enforcement agencies seek to apply existing laws to Bitcoin, they will face the challenge that Bitcoin is not a company with an easily identifiable executive, but instead it's an open source project and a community. The Bitcoin Foundation is central to that community, but it does not encompass the whole community. So as new guidelines and procedures are developed, policymakers should make sure to engage the community and solicit comments from the public to ensure that they benefit from a wide range of perspectives. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks very much for joining us today and for that testimony. If you were here during the testimony of the first panel, you heard me indicate that one of the things I like to do when we're addressing an issue like this, around which there's not a great deal of consensus, is to use these hearings as an opportunity to see if we can develop some. And I thought we made a little progress with the first panel, and I'm hopeful that we can do that, replicate that with the second panel of witnesses. Toward that goal, let me just ask you to reflect on what you've heard from your colleagues on this panel, and just tell me and the staff members that are here, whoever's watching on television here in the Capitol or outside the Capitol, where do you see the agreement among the four of you? The perspectives you shared with us, the opinions that you shared with us, where do you think there's general agreement? Second question, where do you think there's not agreement? And how do we go about reconciling that lack of agreement if we can? Mr. Allen, you want to go first?
Senator Carper, I think there is broad-based agreement about the potential of a digital economy and virtual currencies. I think there is absolute agreement that there is enormous potential for social good and that this is an emerging technology that needs to be protected. I also think there is clear agreement that we can't just ignore the misuse and that the misuse of a digital economy and virtual currencies jeopardizes the viability of virtual currencies, in the longer run. So I don't think there is disagreement at all on those points. As it relates to areas, I also don't think there's a disagreement on the need for basic regulation using the existing tools. The application of AML, the application of money transmitter laws at the exchange level, know your customer, those kinds of provisions. I think maybe the greatest challenge, the greatest area that we have to grapple with is how do we enforce the enforcement techniques to deal with the misuse while preserving the potential long term, and the fact that this truly is a global phenomenon. This is something that the FinCEN guidance on this was just issued in March of this year. The FATF guidance that Director Shasky talked about, the Financial Action Task Force, their guidance on this issue was just issued this summer, I think in July. So my sense is that most of the world is not applying money transmitter laws, is not applying anti-money laundering principles. So I think the question of how we get from here to there regarding an area that there's not great knowledge and understanding about is really the issue that the four of us would have to grapple with.
Thank you. Same question, Mr. Merck, if you would, please. Where do you see consensus agreement? Where do you see a lack of that, and how do we go about reconciling that lack of agreement or consensus?
I'll take the second part first. I don't know that I heard a lot of disagreement or anything that we would generally disagree with from this panel, or even really from the first panel. I was heartened by that. I think that Ernie is correct, that as we move forward, I think that an open dialogue is good, so that as those disagreements do crop up, and they likely will, we can address them quickly and in a safe and sane way. As to where we have agreement, I think what I heard from the other panelists is there's a real need to create on-ramps into the traditional financial system, that by creating those on-ramps, especially here in the U.S., you help to protect the system from abuse. The biggest obstacle to that happening today is not from regulation or from law enforcement, it's from the ability of businesses in the space to get bank accounts and to be integrated into the banking system. There is currently a chill in the banking system and in the banking industry that is preventing businesses from getting just simple, even simple checking accounts. There are stories that if you have the word Bitcoin anywhere in your name or your documentations, you will immediately be, your application will be immediately placed in the circular file, as it will. So I think there's a need to create some leadership within the banking industry to make sure that these companies are onboarded into the traditional system where some of the protections are in place already and the illicit activity can be detected and rooted out.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Allaire.
I'd like to echo some of the other panelists' comments. Clearly, there's consensus here around the innovation that we see, the potential for financial inclusion. I think there's consensus that many of the regulatory frameworks and tools are sufficient and being applied appropriately. I think there's consensus that the open nature of this technology, its development, its use, and its oversight is a very positive framework. I do think that there is some tension around the question of the balance between anonymity and privacy, and whether there are new laws that are required to end the possibility of anonymity on the Internet or to address that in some way. I think, as I stated in my comments, we are very focused within our business on having very deep levels of identity verification, and so we view that as critical. But others within the digital currency world, particularly within geographies that don't have the same kinds of regulatory regimes, may not. And are there other things that we need to be thinking about, other tools that we need to be thinking about for law enforcement that can address some of those issues? So I think that that arena needs additional and careful consideration.
All right, thank you. Mr. Brito.
So I think there certainly is broad consensus among the panel up here, and I was very heartened to hear the first panel's message, and I think we have a lot of consensus. I'll pick two issues just to give you an answer. First, where is there agreement? I was very interested in listening to the gentleman from the Secret Service who said that, in fact, it is centralized currencies that pose the greatest risk as far as money laundering and other illicit uses, and that decentralized currencies like Bitcoin, because of their nature, were not a greater risk. I think that was a great point of agreement there. To pick a point of disagreement, Ms. Shasky sort of took issue with the idea that U.S. businesses might move overseas seeking a better regulatory environment. And I think what her suggestion was that if somebody leaves the U.S. seeking lax regulatory treatment, they're going to find that eventually it's going to catch up with them. And I think the danger is not that somebody who's trying to facilitate an illicit business is going to leave the U.S. The danger is that real hardworking entrepreneurs who are looking to comply just don't find a regulatory environment that is amenable here. That's something that we don't want to allow us to stretch for too much time.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back to Mr. Allen. I think you mentioned the guidance issued earlier this year by FinCEN. And I'm not going to ask this. I'm going to probably ask Mr. Allaire to lead off and respond to this question. But they issued their guidance earlier this year, I think back in the spring, and they stated that virtual currency exchanges and administrators would need to register as money service businesses and apply for money transmitter licenses in the 48 states that require such licenses. I want to ask you just to focus on this with me for a little bit, and I'm going to ask you, each of you, again, some of you already alluded to this guidance and given it some thought, but I just want you to give me just again your thoughts on this guidance from FinCEN. Do you believe that the approach is a good fit for virtual currency exchanges or other virtual currency related businesses? And Mr. Allaire, I'm told that your company has registered with FinCEN and has applied for money transmitter licenses in a couple of states. And so you could maybe, if you would, just offer the first response.
Sure. I think a business that is going to handle consumer funds, store and manage those, and is going to interact with the banking system should be compliant with the rules that have been set forth through the Bank Secrecy Act to protect consumers and ensure that bad actors are not able to operate. So I think, in general, we very much think that these are appropriate guidelines, and I think the digital currency business is, from an entrepreneurial perspective, may be different than other prior internet businesses. Two guys can build a photo sharing app and put it up on the web and get 1 billion users. I don't think it's appropriate that two guys should be able to build a financial services business and operate that without a sufficient investment to protect consumers and protect society. And so I do believe that the bar needs to be higher for financial services businesses in the United States, and that it is not realistic, which I think some in the entrepreneurial community would like to see regulation which doesn't require that level of compliance. I don't think that's realistic. When I founded the company and sought capital to build this company, we understood that the bar was higher, and we raised sufficient capital to be able to launch our product and service in a compliant manner and hire the professionals and staff and put in place the systems and protections that were critical. So we think it's appropriate. There are challenges with how money transmission licenses are granted in the U.S., the broad number of states, the divergent approaches that each state might take, and I do think that creates cost and complexity and could be argued to be an unnecessary regulatory burden, but that is the system that we have, and that is the system that we are pursuing and operating within.
Good, thanks. Others on same issue. Mr. Allen, you want to?
Yes, just briefly, Senator Carper, I agree with Mr. Allaire totally. And what I think is most appropriate about the FinCEN guidance is that it is focused at the exchange level. It does not apply to users, only to those. It's an application of basic money transmitter law. And I think it is an appropriate use of the law, existing law, and I think it's a reasonable approach. I agree with him that one of the great challenges is creating consistency and uniformity because of our federal system and the fact that there could be 50 different approaches. But that's not unique to this issue.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Merck, any thoughts, please?
Yeah, the 50-state money transmitter license regime has come up. I do think that the states have an interest in protecting their consumers. At the same time, it is a bit burdensome, and it has slowed down progress in the U.S. I don't know what the answer to that question is. I know in the EU they have a system of reciprocity where they have a minimum threshold for each country, and if you attain a license in one country, you can passport it to other countries as well. Perhaps that's a framework that would work here, but that would be best left to the legislative branch.
All right, thanks. Mr. Reeder, any thoughts?
One small point regarding the FinCEN guidance. I think it's very clear as it applies to exchanges and to administrators of centralized virtual currencies. I think it's less clear when it applies to users, for example. If the guidance says that you are not required to register with FinCEN if you are acquiring, say, Bitcoin in order to buy goods or services. But let's say, for example, that my mother's from Spain, and recently I helped her send money back home, and it cost 5% of the total amount. What if I was buying Bitcoin simply to remit money overseas, as could be one of the great potential benefits to allow remittances to the third world and to other countries? That is not covered by the FinCEN guidance. So I think the guidance could use further explanation, and I think if FinCEN were to put any further clarification up to public comment, they would, I think, get all the wrinkles out.
Okay, thanks. Let me come back to you, if I could, Mr. Allen. I understand that your organization, International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, was one of the forerunners in bringing together private and public stakeholders to talk about virtual currencies. If you would, first, a couple of questions, but first, who was involved in your working group, and why did you form it?
Mr. Chairman, we formed it because several years ago we had a very positive experience in bringing together financial industry leaders around the fact that the mainstream financial system, the mainstream payment system, credit cards, were being used for the purchase and distribution of child pornography. I called the chairman of a major credit card company and said, "How is this possible?" And he said, "We don't know what these transactions are for. If you can find for us, show for us where the merchant bank is, where the account resides, this is an illegal use of the payment system, we can stop the payments, we can shut down the accounts." So we brought together coalitions in North America, Europe, and Asia, and had enormous positive impact. There was a dramatic decline. But as I began to talk to law enforcement and other leaders around the world, what we determined was that we didn't end it, we just moved it. And we were seeing evidence of a migration of these kinds of illegal operations into this new economy. And so in an effort simply to try to understand it better and determine if it was a problem, to use that same model to bring leaders together, private sector leaders together, to try to develop shared common sense solutions, that's why we joined with Thomson Reuters to create this task force. And it includes the Bitcoin Foundation, it includes the Tor Project, it includes the Gates Foundation and the Brookings Institution, the Cato Institute, Vital Voices, a human rights group. It includes multiple law enforcement groups and representatives. The intent was to bring people together, better understand the problem, and search for common ground. And so that's been our process.
Mm-hmm. Let me just follow it up. And you've partly answered this question, but I want to ask it anyway. But just share with us a bit further what you've been able to learn from the dialogue that you facilitated, especially as it pertains to the exploitation of children around the world.
I think we've really learned a lot in a short time. One of the challenges is most of the evidence is anecdotal because relatively few cases are actually being made. As we've talked to law enforcement, I talked about that earlier in terms of the absence of investigative techniques to probe these kinds of things. But I think we have learned that there is broad-based interest in searching for and finding reasonable solutions that work. We have learned, I think, as was pointed out earlier, that the digital economy is far broader than Bitcoin. So the issues we're focusing on are not just Bitcoin, but, for example, there are 22 million users today of Russia's web money. We have talked about Liberty Reserve and the case that was made there, $6 billion in illegal money laundering. So I think we're discovering it's a complex issue, but I think it's one that is addressable. And I think the most encouraging thing to me is I now believe it's addressable using many of the tools and laws that we already have in place. That one of the biggest challenges for policymakers is simply to increase the level of awareness so that countries around the world will begin to use the tools they already have.
Well, that in part is the reason we're having this hearing. Well, good. I was talking with a fellow who goes to the same church as we do back in Delaware the other day. He's in the auto business, sells a lot of cars. He has dealerships, sell a lot of cars in our state. And he was talking about the work of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, established a couple of years ago, hopefully to look out for the interest of consumers throughout this country in a lot of different ways. But I want to focus just a little bit on consumers, if we could. And I've been told that virtual currencies pose a number of questions as to their use by consumers. And I have maybe two questions, but the first is, Maybe we should go down the panel, or go up the panel. Mr. Brito, we'll start with you. And if you will, just give us some of your thoughts on whether virtual currencies have sufficient protections built in to them for consumers. And do virtual currencies raise any additional and new issues for consumer protection? For example, do we need to do anything to better protect consumers from fraud or to protect consumer privacy as a result of these virtual currencies?
So I think that this is a very nascent industry and is still trying to find its way. As a result, that means that the folks who are at this point participating in this economy really have to try hard to participate in it. So these are not your average consumers just yet jumping in to this space. So at this point, I think it gives regulators some time to learn more about the technology and learn more about what the industry players are doing to address these concerns and whether the existing consumer protection laws are enough. As far as opportunities, what's interesting about especially decentralized digital currencies is that they provide a new choice for consumers. Today, if you want to use electronic payments, you're probably going to be using a credit card or something like PayPal, and that comes with fees, sometimes high fees, and those fees are important because they provide things like insurance. If you have your identity stolen, or if something that you received is not what you ordered, you can always have a charge reversed. Decentralized digital currencies are like cash in that there's nothing to reverse, but that also means that there are very little fees. So this now presents a new choice for consumers. They can choose insured but more expensive, or not insured but less expensive. That's a new choice for consumers that wasn't there before.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Allaire?
I think there's many issues around consumer adoption of digital currency. I'll touch on a couple of them. We emphasize that Bitcoin as a digital currency offers great potential to lower the fraud risk that both consumers and merchants face on a day-to-day basis when we conduct payments. When we go into a restaurant and give our credit card out, or when we enter that information online, we're effectively giving out the keys to our bank account to every counterparty that we interact with. And so it should not be a surprise that we've seen dramatic growth in the amount of identity theft, and specifically financial information, private financial information being stolen and sold on black markets and used for nefarious reasons. Protocols like Bitcoin reduce that risk because the keys to your bank account, the keys to your money, are never transmitted. And that's one of the brilliant aspects of the design of the system. And so there's real potential to lower occurrences of financial fraud in consumer transactions and increase consumer privacy as a result. So I think those are really key benefits. But there are risks, clearly, for consumers. I think one risk, and this is one that we take very seriously as we look at this, is increasingly, because of ease of use, consumers that want to take advantage of things like Bitcoin are using online services that essentially host their Bitcoin on servers or on the Internet. And because Bitcoin itself, the mechanism by which funds can be used is based on keys that we then in turn would store, there's a real risk around the security of funds. And we've seen occurrences just in the past weeks of startups who did not have appropriate levels of security around those funds, where those funds were effectively stolen. And so I think there's really critical requirements around the safeguarding of funds, the custodianship of these keys, and best practices and methods to employ that. I think industry is driving forward on that, but I think that's a key issue that the CFPB may take a look at. I think there's the flip side, which is this question of what I would call merchant fraud, which is the chargeback scenario. You didn't get the product, you got the wrong product, someone had inappropriately used your account. I think that there are methods for addressing that within the technology of Bitcoin today and within improvements that are coming in upcoming versions of Bitcoin, mechanisms to create refunds to consumers, mechanisms to provide greater transparency around what you're paying for, and there are mechanisms even that are not well understood, I think generally, but which will become available, where funds can be held in escrow until a product has been delivered to a consumer. So there are ways to address some of that merchant fraud risk as well, and I think you're going to see industry participants pushing forward on that in the coming months and years.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Merck, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There are consumer protection issues in the Bitcoin space, and I'll reserve my comments strictly to Bitcoin and decentralized currencies. When you look at Bitcoin especially, we haven't even released version 0.9 yet, so we're not on version 1.0. It's very much still an experimental currency, and it should be considered a high-risk environment for consumers and investors at the moment. That's changing over time as businesses like Mr. Allaire's and others are coming into the space and building the service layers on top of the Bitcoin protocol to make it safer for consumers to move in. Those service layers are both technological. Bitcoin has been referred to as programmable money, so you can build in layers of escrow and dispute mediation and things like that right into your payment structure, which is a very interesting concept. As most of the laws that exist for consumer protection in the payment space were built around traditional methods where those weren't possible. So potentially you don't need as much regulation on the consumer side in the long term to the midterm as this system grows up. In the short term, consumers should be aware that this is a high-risk environment and that potentially it's not quite ready for mass consumer adoption today. That time is coming, but it's not here yet.
Thank you. Mr. Allen.
The other panelists are the experts, so I don't think I have much to add other than to say one of the groups we met with on this were central bankers and financial industry leaders, and they clearly view, as I think the other panelists do, virtual currencies as akin to cash. So there is no FDIC. There is that not that level of protection. So I think it has to be viewed as high risk, and I think the points that the other panelists made about the fact that consumer protections are part of a work in progress, but certainly something that we need to be very much aware of.
Okay. In anticipation of this hearing, I was asking the members of our staff, I said, tell me a little bit, where did Bitcoin come from? Who was the creator? Who are the creators? And I'm told that the protocol was developed either by maybe a programmer or by a group of programmers that go by the name, I think it's Satoshi Nakamoto. Is that correct? Okay. And with all the money and attention that's been given to Bitcoin, it just seems strange to me that either this individual or this group would choose to remain anonymous. What do we know about this person? What do we know about this group? Does it matter that his or her or their identity remains a mystery? Mr. Bader, do you want to? Who wants to go first? Mr. Merck, you want to go first? Go ahead.
I'll go ahead and field that one for everybody. Satoshi Nakamoto is the pseudonym for the creator or creators, he, she, they, who developed the Bitcoin protocol and released the original white paper, the spec for the Bitcoin protocol into the world, in addition to the original code base that was then open sourced to the entire community. This person or group of people has since left the scene, as it were. At least, if not more than half of the code base from that original code has already been rewritten. While I think everybody is grateful for that incredible contribution, at this moment in time, who Satoshi is largely irrelevant to the story of Bitcoin going forward. And I think that was intentional, and possibly why a pseudonym was chosen in the first place.
All right. Anybody want to add to that, please? Rito?
I just want to address, it is a little strange that Bitcoin, we don't know who the creator is. And so that often conjures up the idea that there's some risk here that we have not.
You don't think it was Al Gore, do you?
You know, he's never denied it. But I think the key thing to emphasize is that Bitcoin, especially the code base, is open source. That means it is completely open and audible and available to anybody to look at. And in fact, many very smart programmers and cryptographers have looked at it and have given it their seal of approval. And as Mr. Merck said, more than half of the code base has been written by others than Satoshi at this point. So, I'm pretty confident that the software is what it says on the tin.
All right. We're just about to start voting over in the Capitol. So I think we'll wrap it up by. I just want to say, I love to quote Albert Einstein. Not all my colleagues do, but he said some just really memorable things. One of the things he says: "In adversity lies opportunity." Think about it. In adversity lies opportunity. God knows there's plenty of adversity with respect to these virtual currencies that we've talked about. It's not just potential. It's not just possible. It's real. And we need to be not just mindful of that, but vigilant to make sure that we contain it and eliminate it where we can. I understand. I only know one quote from that's attributed to Mrs. Einstein, and I find it sort of relates to my efforts to try to get my head around this whole issue of virtual currencies and Bitcoin. Mrs. Einstein, who apparently was quite brilliant in her own right, and was once asked if she understood her husband's theory of relativity, and she allegedly responded, I understand the words, but not the sentences. Think about that. I understand the words, but not the sentences. When I first started trying to understand what this was all about, I sort of felt like Mrs. Einstein, and said, I understand the words, but not the sentences. With the help of our first panel and all of you on the second panel, and with the help of my staff and a lot of other folks that have come by to brief us, I'm starting to understand more than just the words, but a few of the sentences too. And that's really why we wanted to hold this hearing today, to better understand what's going on here, the pitfalls that come from this technology, but also the potential value to our society, to consumers, and to businesses. And I said earlier, I thought the first panel, I thought they gave us a lot of thought-provoking information. I thought they were very thoughtful, and but it's also encouraging. It was encouraging, and I find that that's been true here with this panel as well. So for that, we thank you, and on behalf of my colleagues who are not here, who are flying in from all over the country right now in order to make this 5:30 vote, I thank you. They don't know I'm thanking you, but I'll thank you in their absence. Someday they'll thank me for thanking you, I hope. But we have a bit of a shared responsibility here in trying to figure out how to make this work so that we minimize the bad that can flow from it and maximize the good. With that, I think we'll wrap it up here. And I'm going to just to note that the hearing record will remain open for 15 days. That's until December 3rd at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. I suspect we'll have a few, may have a few from me. If you receive those questions, I would just ask that you respond to them promptly. Again, to our staff, especially John Collins, who first brought this to me months ago. I want to thank our staffs, both majority and minority staff, and for you and for our first panel for joining us today and for the work that you've done in helping to enlighten us a bit on this subject. With that, we're adjourned, and thank you so much.